In 1858, in the rolling hills of western Virginia, the state began raising walls of blue sandstone, a project built on a radical belief that madness could be cured with architecture. They called it the Lunatic Asylum west of the Allegheny Mountains, a monumental promise carved into the earth. Its design, conceived by Dr. Story Kirkbride, was meant to be a therapeutic instrument, a machine for healing where sunlight, fresh air, and orderly routine would restore minds fractured by chaos. The central clock tower was to be its heart, the long, staggered wings its lungs, breathing sanity back into those society had cast aside. It was to be the largest hand-cut stone building in North America, a testament to a new, humane philosophy of care. But even as the first stones were laid by immigrant masons, a darkness was gathering on the nation's horizon. The very ground on which this sanctuary was built was trembling with the approach of civil war, a conflict that would stain the asylum's purpose before its first patient ever walked its halls. The promise was of a cure, a place of peace, but the structure that rose from the quiet hills of Weston would become something else entirely, a container for suffering on a scale its creators never imagined. Its story is not just one of architectural ambition, but of how an ideal, when pressed by the weight of human desperation, collapses into a monument of control. What began as a machine for healing would soon become a factory of despair. To understand the asylum at Weston, you must first understand the man whose philosophy was its blueprint, Dr. Story Kirkbride. In the mid-19th century, the treatment of the mentally ill was a landscape of horrors. The insane were often confined to squalid almshouses, chained in basements, or displayed in cages for public amusement. Brutality was the standard of care. Kirkbride, a Quaker physician from Pennsylvania, offered a revolutionary alternative he called moral treatment. He argued that madness was not a permanent stain on the soul, but a treatable condition, often triggered by the stresses of modern life. The cure, he believed, lay not in punishment but in environment. In his 1854 treatise on the construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane, he laid out a precise architectural prescription. The asylum was to be a special apparatus, a self-contained world designed to counteract the chaos of a disordered mind. Every detail was therapeutic. Long, echeloned wings ensured each patient room received direct sunlight and cross-ventilation, believed to disperse the miasmas or foul airs that bred illness. High ceilings would lift the spirits, while wide corridors would encourage calm movement. Kirkbride's vision was holistic. The building was to be set on vast grounds with farms, gardens, and workshops. He insisted that productive labor, tending crops, milking cows, sewing garments, was essential medicine, restoring a patient's sense of purpose and self-worth. It was a philosophy of radical compassion for its time, replacing chains with structure and dungeons with sunlight. Weston was to be its grandest expression, a cathedral of moral treatment. But embedded in Kirkbride's humane design was a fatal vulnerability. It depended on a delicate arithmetic of space, staff, and patience. If that arithmetic were ever broken, his apparatus for healing would invert, becoming an instrument that amplified the very despair it was meant to cure. The man tasked with translating Kirkbride's philosophy into stone was Richard Snowden Andrews, a Baltimore architect known for his command of the dramatic Gothic revival style. Andrews' design for Weston was as much a declaration of power as it was a plan for a hospital. The facade stretched for nearly a quarter of a mile, a fortress of hand-cut blue sandstone crowned by a clock tower soaring almost 200 feet into the sky. Its pointed arches, crenellated battlements, and imposing central structure blurred the line between a medieval castle and a state institution. The choice of style was deliberate. In an era anxious about the hidden populations of the insane, the Gothic grandeur was meant to reassure the public. This was not a place to hide the unwanted, but a dignified, almost romantic sanctuary where science and morality would triumph over madness. For the farmers and townspeople who watched it rise from the surrounding farmland, it was a spectacle of modern ambition, a symbol of the state's benevolent power. Yet, the very architecture that projected dignity also broadcast an unnerving authority. Its towering walls and fortress-like presence could be interpreted not as a refuge, but as an impenetrable prison. For those who would one day be brought through its gates, the sheer scale of the stone must have been an overwhelming statement of their own powerlessness. Andrews had perfectly captured Kirkbride's vision, but in doing so, he had also created a structure whose meaning was unsettlingly ambiguous. Was it a hospital designed to look like a castle, or a castle designed to function as a prison? The asylum's stone skin was a paradox. It promised care but also threatened confinement, projected civility while enforcing absolute control. This duality was carved into its very foundation, a tension that would define the institution for the next 130 years, long after its architectural beauty had become a mask for the horrors within. The construction of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was a monumental feat of human labor, a testament to the brute force required to turn an ideal into a physical reality. Beginning in 1858, skilled stonemasons, many of them immigrants from Ireland and Germany, were brought to Weston to work the local blue sandstone. The quarries buzzed with the relentless percussion of hammers and chisels as massive blocks of stone were hewn from the earth. These stones, some weighing several tons, were then hauled by teams of oxen to the construction site. There, each block was meticulously hand-cut and dressed, its surface textured with the faint, rhythmic marks of a mason's tools that are still visible today. Scaffolding, a complex web of timber and rope, climbed higher against the sky each year as the walls rose. The scale of the project was unlike anything the region had ever seen. For the local community, it was a source of both awe and employment. But for the laborers, it was grueling, dangerous work. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their hands raw, their bodies strained by the sheer weight of the materials. The asylum was built on their sweat and skill, a structure whose grandeur was paid for by anonymous toil. The process was painstakingly slow, a deliberate assembly of stone upon stone. As the long, staggered wings took shape and the central tower began its ascent, the building seemed to grow organically from the hillside. It was a slow-motion spectacle of order being imposed on nature, mirroring the asylum's ultimate mission to impose order on the human mind. Yet, this slow, methodical creation stood in stark contrast to the storm that was gathering across the country. Even as these men worked to build a sanctuary for the mentally unstable, the nation itself was slipping into its own madness, and the asylum, still an unfinished skeleton of stone, was about to be caught in the crossfire. By the spring of 1861, the rhythmic clang of masons' hammers fell silent. The Civil War had erupted, and the asylum, a project funded by the state of Virginia, was abandoned mid-construction. The men who had been shaping its walls were now drawn into regiments, trading their tools for rifles. The unfinished structure, with its hollow clock tower and roofless wings, became a monument to interruption, its serene purpose violated by the chaos of war. Its strategic location and immense size made it a valuable asset. The building was seized multiple times by both Union and Confederate forces. Its cavernous, incomplete corridors, meant to echo with the quiet shuffle of patience, instead rang with the march of soldiers' boots. The grounds, intended for therapeutic strolls, became a military encampment and a depot for supplies. The asylum's first life was not as a hospital, but as a barracks and a fortress. In 1863, the conflict reshaped its identity permanently. The western counties of Virginia seceded, forming the new state of West Virginia. The asylum, authorized and begun by one government, was now claimed by another. Its name was changed to the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, its allegiance redrawn by the new political map. When the war finally ended, construction resumed, but the institution was forever scarred by the interruption. The conflict had not only delayed its completion, but had also inaugurated it with an identity of instability and violence. It was a sanctuary born from a battlefield, a place of order conceived in a time of national fracture. The promise of tranquility carved into its stones had already been proven fragile. Before a single patient was admitted for treatment, the asylum had already learned that it could not stand apart from the turbulence of the world outside its walls. That turbulence was now a part of its very foundation. In October 1864, while the Civil War still raged and much of the complex remained a construction site, the asylum admitted its first patients. There was no grand ceremony, no declaration of a new era of care. Instead, a few dozen men and women were quietly escorted past stacks of lumber and benches of stone dust into wards that smelled more of fresh mortar than of antiseptic. The institution that was meant to be a perfected machine for healing began its life half-built, a place where the state's promises and its failures existed side by side. The early admission ledgers, written in the neat, looping script of a 19th-century clerk, reveal a world where the line between mental illness and social inconvenience was perilously thin. The reasons for commitment were rarely medical diagnoses in the modern sense. They were social judgments. Entries list causes like religious excitement, intemperance, domestic trouble, and even laziness. A woman grieving too long for a lost child might be diagnosed with melancholia. A man whose political opinions were too fervent could be committed for overexcitement. An epileptic seizure, a bout of severe depression, or simply the eccentricities of old age were all sufficient grounds for a life behind these stone walls. These were not diseases to be cured, but behaviors to be controlled. The asylum became a repository for anyone who disrupted the social order. The admission process offered little protection. A petition from a husband, a complaint from a neighbor, or a decision by a local official was often enough. Once committed, the individual entered a world governed by keys and clocks, their life now housed in walls designed to outlast them. In those first years, as carpenters, hammers still echoed through the unfinished wings. A fundamental truth of the institution was established. Its purpose was not just to treat the ill, but to contain the unwanted. For nearly 2 decades after the first patients arrived, the asylum remained in a perpetual state of becoming. The final work on the sprawling complex would not be declared complete until 1881, 17 years after it opened its doors. Patients lived in a hospital that was also an active construction site, a place of echoing, unfinished corridors and drafty, incomplete wards. This prolonged birth crippled the therapeutic potential of Kirkbride's design before it ever had a chance to stabilize. His philosophy was a delicate ecosystem that depended on every part working in harmony, the precise ratio of patients to space, the availability of gardens and workshops, the calming effect of a finished, orderly environment. At Weston, this harmony was never achieved. The chronic funding shortages and disruptions that began with the Civil War became a permanent feature of its existence. The Gothic arches, intended to admit therapeutic light, instead let in chilling drafts. The long wings, meant to provide airy separation, were often closed off or incomplete. The ideal of a perfectly calibrated healing machine was always one step ahead of the compromised reality. The building that stood completed in 1881 was a magnificent sight, its stone facade finally whole, its clock tower keeping time over the valley. But inside, the promise was already eroding. Kirkbride's careful arithmetic had been violated from the start. The intended capacity of 250 patients was a philosophical number, not a practical one, and the pressures of a post-war society were already pushing against it. The asylum was a monument to a beautiful theory, but it had been born into a world of harsh necessities. When the last scaffold was finally taken down, the institution was less a place of cure than an immense, echoing container whose architectural grandeur could no longer hide the fractures in its foundation. The stage was set for a slow, century-long collapse. The asylum's ledgers are a chilling chronicle of society's fears. To read them today is to see how easily a life could be redefined by a single word written by a clerk. Alongside recognizable conditions like epilepsy and dementia, the pages are filled with diagnoses that reveal more about 19th-century morality than about medicine. Men were committed for political excitement, masturbation, or novel reading. Women were admitted for hysteria, disappointment in love, or fits of passion. These were not medical conditions. They were violations of social norms. The asylum's purpose had subtly expanded. It was no longer just a hospital for the insane. It had become an instrument of social control, a place to dispose of anyone who was inconvenient, nonconformist, or simply poor. A family unable to care for an elderly relative with dementia could have them committed. A husband wishing to be rid of a troublesome wife could accuse her of domestic trouble. An outcast, an addict, or an eccentric could be swept from public view and locked behind Weston's stone walls, their identity replaced by a case number. The institution became a catch-all for the frayed edges of society. The logic of admission was the logic of removal. What society could not tolerate, it confined. What it could not explain, it labeled as madness. The process was chillingly simple. A brief hearing, often without the accused present, was enough. Once the commitment papers were signed, the person's life was irrevocably altered. They were transported to Weston, where their personal history was erased and replaced by a diagnosis in a ledger. Each line in these books, written in steady, bureaucratic script, represents a human life redirected, a voice silenced. The asylum's walls were built of sandstone, but its true foundation was the administrative violence of the clerk's pen. Kirkbride's vision of moral treatment extended beyond the asylum's architecture and into the rhythms of daily life. Weston was designed to be a completely self-sufficient world, a sprawling estate where patients would find healing through labor. The grounds were a city of industry. A massive farm with orchards, vegetable gardens, and pastures produced most of the institution's food. A dairy supplied fresh milk and butter, a herd of pigs provided meat, and a hennery produced eggs. Within the asylum's walls, workshops hummed with activity. Patients operated a blacksmith shop, a furniture-making workshop, a shoe repair store, and a mattress factory. Women were typically assigned to the sewing rooms, where they stitched and mended all the clothing and linens for the entire population, or worked in the industrial-scale laundry and kitchens. This was not presented as exploitation, it was doctrine. Kirkbride argued that idleness bred insanity, while structured work restored dignity and self-control. On the surface, it appeared to be a humane and productive system. Visitors in the late 19th century wrote admiringly of the orderly fields and the busy workshops. Patients were not languishing in cells. They were active, contributing members of a community. But beneath this therapeutic veneer lay a coercive economy. The work was not voluntary. Refusal to participate was seen as a symptom of illness, a sign of noncompliance that could be met with punishment or increased restrictions. The asylum's very survival depended on this unpaid labor. It drastically reduced operational costs, allowing the institution to function even when state funding faltered. The line between therapy and servitude blurred until it disappeared completely. Patients were not just being treated. They were powering the very machine that confined them, their labor becoming another lock on their own cage. The Kirkbride plan was built on a foundation of numbers. Its success depended on maintaining a delicate ratio, 250 patients, a specific amount of square footage per person, and a sufficient number of staff to provide individualized care. This was the mathematical formula for a cure, but at Weston, the formula was broken almost immediately. By 1880, less than 2 decades after opening, the asylum's population had swelled to 717, nearly triple its intended capacity. The state of West Virginia, eager to centralize its insane population, began emptying its local jails and poorhouses, sending a steady stream of new inmates to Weston. The asylum became the state's default solution for a wide range of social problems, and its population began to climb relentlessly. The effect on Kirkbride's therapeutic environment was catastrophic. Rooms designed for a single patient now held 2, then 3, then 4. Privacy, a cornerstone of his philosophy, became an unimaginable luxury. The wide, airy corridors, meant for quiet contemplation, were filled with cots, transforming them into crowded, noisy dormitories. The very architecture designed to soothe the mind began to amplify its agitation. The constant noise, the lack of personal space, and the sheer density of bodies created an environment of perpetual stress and conflict. The staggered wings, designed to provide light and ventilation, were now traps for foul air and disease. The institution's staff was completely overwhelmed. A single attendant might be responsible for a ward of 50 or more patients, making any form of genuine therapeutic interaction impossible. Care devolved into crowd control. The asylum was no longer a hospital, it was a human warehouse. This was not a temporary crisis, but a permanent state of being. The problem of overcrowding was a fracture that ran through the institution's entire history, a slow-motion disaster that would only deepen with each passing decade, turning a sanctuary of healing into a crucible of suffering. Just as the asylum's walls were built to separate the sane from the insane, they were also designed to enforce the racial hierarchies of the outside world. In 1873, a separate building was constructed on the asylum grounds, designated the asylum for colored patients. While Kirkbride's philosophy spoke of a universal design for healing, in practice, segregation was written directly into the stone. Black men and women were confined to these distinct, and often inferior, quarters. Their care was an afterthought, their conditions a reflection of the deep-seated prejudice that permeated 19th-century America. The very act of creating a separate building was a statement. It encoded racial discrimination into the therapeutic landscape, suggesting that the path to mental wellness was different, and lesser, for Black patients. Archival records and reports from the period often describe the colored wards as more crowded and less well-maintained than their white counterparts. They received less funding, fewer were often the last to receive repairs or improvements. The promise of sunlight, fresh air, and moral treatment was a promise that did not extend equally to all. This architectural segregation reinforced the social erasure of Black patients. Already marginalized by society, they were further isolated within the institution. Their diagnoses were often clouded by racial stereotypes, their behaviors misinterpreted through a lens of prejudice. The asylum, which was supposed to be a place of scientific and moral progress, simply mirrored and amplified the injustices of the world it was meant to correct. For Black patients, the experience of confinement was a double one. They were imprisoned not only by a diagnosis of insanity, but also by the color of their skin. The walls of Weston were designed to treat the mind, but they also served to perpetuate a sickness of the soul that afflicted the entire nation. As the patient population exploded, the staff who worked within the asylum's walls were caught in an impossible situation. The state legislature never allocated enough funding to hire the number of attendants Kirkbride's plan required. A single nurse or attendant was often left in charge of a ward containing dozens, sometimes over 100, patients with a vast range of conditions, from severe psychosis to dementia to profound depression. The dream of moral treatment, with its emphasis on gentle persuasion and individualized care, became a cruel joke. There was no time for conversation, for therapy, or for compassion. A workday was a frantic exercise in survival, a desperate attempt to maintain a basic level of order in a sea of human need. The primary goal shifted from healing to containment. Attendants, often poorly paid and with little to no medical training, resorted to the only tools they had: routine, intimidation, and restraint. The daily schedule became a rigid, impersonal machine. Patients were herded from beds to meals to chores and back again, their individuality dissolving into the mass. Any deviation from the routine was met with swift and often harsh discipline. The asylum's own internal reports from the late 19th and early 20th centuries hint at the grim reality. They speak of understaffing, long hours, and the constant threat of violence. Burnout was rampant. The chronic stress and overwhelming conditions could turn even well-intentioned staff into callous custodians. Abuse, while not officially sanctioned, became an open secret of the overcrowded wards, a frustrated shove, a prolonged stay in isolation, or the overuse of restraints. The staff were not necessarily monsters. They were cogs in a broken machine, forced by the system's failures to become agents of control rather than care. They, too, were prisoners of the asylum's impossible arithmetic. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a new and dangerous ideology began to seep into the field of psychiatry: eugenics. This pseudoscience, which promoted the idea of improving the human race through selective breeding, cast a dark shadow over institutions like Weston. The mentally ill were no longer seen simply as individuals suffering from a treatable condition. Instead, they were increasingly viewed as genetically defective, their madness, a hereditary taint that threatened the health of the entire population. This shift in thinking had profound consequences for the patients at Weston. They were no longer just sick, they were a biological threat. The asylum's purpose subtly transformed from a place of potential cure to a long-term warehouse for the unfit. The goal was no longer to return patients to society, but to permanently remove them and their bad blood from the gene pool. This ideology justified the institution's worst failures. Overcrowding and neglect were easier to tolerate if the inmates were considered genetically inferior. The push for therapies that would render patients docile and, in some cases, sterile gained momentum. The language used in medical reports and public discourse became colder, more clinical, and more detached. Patients were described not in terms of their personal suffering, but as carriers of defective traits. This eugenic mindset created a perfect storm when combined with the asylum's existing problems. It provided a scientific-sounding rationale for the custodial care that had already taken hold. It eased the consciences of legislators who consistently underfunded the institution. And it sealed the fate of thousands of patients, condemning them to a lifetime of confinement, not because they were incurable, but because they had been judged unworthy of a place in the world. The dream of moral treatment was dead, replaced by the nightmare of biological determinism. By the 1950s, the asylum at Weston reached its breaking point. The patient population peaked at an astonishing 2,600 people, crammed into a facility designed for just 250. It was no longer a hospital. It had become a city of the forgotten, its population larger than that of the surrounding town. The sheer scale of the overcrowding caused a complete collapse of the building's infrastructure and any remaining semblance of therapeutic care. State inspection reports from this era paint a horrifying picture. Patients were sleeping on mattresses packed together on the floors of corridors and day rooms. Wards were so dense with bodies that it was difficult to walk through them. The sanitary systems, designed for a fraction of the population, failed completely. Toilets constantly overflowed, and a foul, suffocating odor clung to the entire building. The aging heating system was inadequate, and in the winter, patients suffered from the bitter cold. The lighting was dim and depressing, with many areas lit by single, bare bulbs. Fires were a constant hazard. In 1935, a major blaze destroyed a section of the main building, killing several patients and highlighting the extreme vulnerability of the overcrowded facility. While repairs were made, they were merely patches on a system that was fundamentally broken. In this environment, human dignity was impossible. Patients were treated not as individuals, but as a herd. Meals were served in chaotic, overcrowded dining halls. Personal possessions were non-existent. Violence was a daily occurrence, as patients and overwhelmed staff alike cracked under the relentless pressure. The asylum had become a perfect machine for generating misery. Its majestic Gothic facade was a grotesque mask, hiding a world of squalor, disease, and despair. The promise of healing through architecture had become a cruel joke. The building itself had become the primary instrument of torment. Within the decaying walls of the mid-century asylum, the practice of medicine devolved into a brutalist form of human maintenance. Among the most common treatments was hydrotherapy, a practice that, in theory, used water to soothe or stimulate the nervous system. In the hydrotherapy suites at Weston, rows of white enamel tubs stood ready. For agitated or manic patients, the prescription was a continuous warm bath, a treatment that could last for hours or even days. The patient would be placed in a tub of warm water, and a canvas sheet would be secured over the top with only their head exposed, effectively imprisoning them in a liquid cage. Attendants would monitor the water temperature, but the therapeutic benefit was secondary to the real purpose: immobilization. For patients suffering from depression or catatonia, the treatment was the opposite. They would be subjected to ice-cold water, either through high-pressure hoses or by being wrapped in frozen, wet sheets. This was intended to shock the system back into a state of alertness, but in reality, it was a form of torture, a violent assault on a body already weakened by illness and neglect. These treatments were administered in damp, echoing rooms that felt more like dungeons than clinics. The steam from the tubs mingled with the smell of disinfectant and human waste. For the patients, the experience was one of terror and helplessness. Submerged, restrained, or shocked with cold, they were completely at the mercy of the attendants. Hydrotherapy was the perfect treatment for an overcrowded, understaffed institution. It required minimal supervision and effectively subdued difficult patients for long periods. It was justified in medical textbooks and prescribed by doctors, but in practice, it was another instrument of control, a way to impose stillness on bodies when the resources to calm minds were long gone. When water failed to impose order, canvas and leather were used instead. The straitjacket is the most infamous symbol of the old asylums, and at Weston, it was a ubiquitous tool. Prescribed to prevent patients from harming themselves or others, it was more often used as a substitute for supervision. An attendant facing a ward of agitated patients could use restraints to enforce a grim, artificial silence where conversation and care had failed. For the person inside, the experience was a living nightmare. Arms bound tightly across the chest, the body unable to move, hours would stretch into an eternity of discomfort and panic. But the straitjacket was only one of a grim collection of restraints. There were leather cuffs for wrists and ankles, used to strap patients to their beds for days on end. There were isolation rooms, bare, windowless cells where a person could be locked away in total darkness and silence, a punishment that could break even the strongest spirit. Some reports even mention the use of tranquilizer chairs, heavy wooden chairs where a patient could be strapped down, their head enclosed in a wooden box to block all sight and sound. For those deemed the most uncontrollable, there were even small wooden cages, too small to stand up or lie down in, where a person could be confined like an animal. Each of these devices was given a therapeutic justification in the institution's records: calming, excitement, preventing injury, providing a low-stimulus environment. But this clinical language was a thin veil for the brutal reality. These were instruments of punishment and control, designed to make the impossible job of managing thousands of desperate people manageable. They were the physical manifestation of the institution's core failure, the complete abandonment of humanity in the pursuit of order. In the late 1940s, a new and terrifyingly efficient method for imposing order arrived at Weston. It was sold as a miracle cure, a surgical solution to the most stubborn forms of mental illness. It was the transorbital lobotomy, and its champion was a neurologist named Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman was a showman and a zealot, convinced he had found a way to liberate patients from their mental torment. His procedure was shockingly simple and brutal. He would have the patient rendered unconscious, often through electroshock. Then, using a tool that resembled a common ice pick, he would lift the patient's eyelid, insert the pick into the corner of the eye socket, and with a tap from a surgical mallet, drive it through the thin layer of bone into the frontal lobes of the brain. He would then sweep the ice pick back and forth, severing the connections that he believed were the source of the patient's psychosis. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. It required no operating room, no complex surgical equipment. Freeman could perform dozens in a single day, moving from patient to patient with his traveling case of tools. He called his custom-made ice pick the orbitoclast, and his procedure a surgically induced childhood, claiming it calmed agitated patients by reducing their emotional complexity. He traveled the country in a van he called the lobotomobile, demonstrating his technique at overcrowded and desperate state hospitals. For institutions like Weston, buckling under the weight of thousands of patients, Freeman's promise of a quick, cheap, and permanent solution was irresistible. He offered a way to make the unmanageable manageable, to silence the most disruptive voices forever. The ice pick was coming to the wards. West Virginia embraced Dr. Freeman's procedure with chilling enthusiasm. The state government, desperate to reduce the population of its overflowing asylums, sanctioned the West Virginia lobotomy project. Between 1948 and the mid-1950s, hundreds of lobotomies were performed across the state's 4 mental hospitals, with Weston being a primary site. The scale of the project was staggering. One report from 1952 documents that 228 procedures were performed in the state in just 2 weeks. Freeman himself made numerous trips to Weston, where he would work his way through the wards, performing dozens of lobotomies in a single visit. The selection of patients was often arbitrary. While some were chosen for their violent or self-destructive behavior, others were selected simply because they were considered a nuisance to the staff. There was little diagnostic rigor. The procedure was presented to families as a cutting-edge treatment, a last hope for their loved ones. Many, exhausted by years of dealing with severe mental illness, consented, unaware of the devastating potential consequences. The operations were performed in non-sterile rooms, an assembly line process of electroshock, ice pick, and mallet. Patients were escorted from their crowded wards, subjected to the procedure, and then returned, often with 2 black eyes being the only visible sign of what had happened. The ice pick lobotomy was the ultimate instrument of control. Where hydrotherapy and straitjackets offered temporary silence, the lobotomy promised a permanent one. It was a way to solve the problem of overcrowding and understaffing not by improving conditions, but by surgically altering the patients to make them less troublesome. The state hailed it as progress, a triumph of modern medicine. But in the quiet, subdued wards of Weston, a different story was unfolding, a story of personalities erased and lives irrevocably broken. The aftermath of the West Virginia lobotomy project was a landscape of human ruin. While Dr. Freeman and state officials selectively publicized the successes, patients who became calm, docile, and able to be sent home, the reality for many was far darker. A follow-up study conducted years later revealed a spectrum of devastating outcomes. Many patients were left in a childlike, catatonic state, unable to care for themselves, their personalities stripped away. They became placid, emotionless shells, their inner world silenced forever. The operation that was supposed to liberate them from their illness instead imprisoned them in a new cognitive void. For some, the effects were even worse. The procedure could result in seizures, loss of motor control, and a complete inability to function. Instead of being discharged, these patients became even more dependent on the institution, condemned to live out their days in a state of profound disability. At Weston, the lobotomized patients became a haunting presence in the wards. They were the quiet ones, the ones who no longer caused trouble. Their docility was hailed as a success, proof that the treatment worked. But to those who looked closer, it was clear that something essential had been destroyed. Their agitation was gone, but so was their spark, their identity, their soul. The West Virginia lobotomy project quietly faded away in the late 1950s, made obsolete by the arrival of new antipsychotic medications and growing criticism of the procedure's brutal effects. But for the hundreds of patients who underwent the surgery, there was no reversal. The legacy of the ice pick was carved permanently into their brains. It was the asylum's most intimate and irreversible act of violence, a scientific solution that revealed itself to be the ultimate form of erasure. Behind the main asylum building on a quiet, grassy slope lies the institution's final, silent record, its cemetery. Here, the erasure that defined life inside Weston was made permanent in death. For over 130 years, patients who died within the asylum's walls and whose bodies were unclaimed by family were buried on this hill. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of graves here, but the true number will never be known. The asylum's records of death are as incomplete as its records of cure. Many of the earliest graves are marked only with simple, anonymous field stones. Later, the state issued small metal markers, but they bore no names. Instead, they were stamped with a number, reducing a person's entire existence to a final, bureaucratic digit. Even these markers are disappearing. Over the decades, many have been toppled, consumed by the earth, or simply lost. Walking through the cemetery today is a profoundly unsettling experience. The rows are irregular, the ground uneven. It feels less like a formal burial ground and more like a forgotten field where the dead were disposed of with minimal ceremony. The causes of death recorded in the asylum's surviving ledgers are often vague and clinical: exhaustion, infirmity, decline. These words conceal a universe of suffering. They do not tell of the tuberculosis that ran rampant in the crowded wards, the influenza epidemics that swept through the building, or the quiet, lonely deaths from malnutrition and neglect. The cemetery is the physical evidence of the asylum's ultimate failure. It was a place where people could live for decades and die without anyone on the outside world knowing or caring. Their lives were contained within the institution, and in the end, so were their deaths. The unmarked graves on the hill are the asylum's truest archive, a testament to the countless stories that were lost, the names that were forgotten, and the lives that were simply thrown away. Amidst the overwhelming statistics of suffering, it is the fragments of individual stories that haunt the most. Joseph, a farmer committed in 1892 for overwork and financial trouble, spent 30 years at Weston. His admission notes describe a man broken by the loss of his farm. He died in 1922, his cause of death listed as melancholia. His life was reduced to a single, inadequate word. Then there was Elizabeth, admitted in 1910 at the age of 19 for hysteria and disappointment in love. She had been rejected by a suitor. She never left the asylum, living through the eras of hydrotherapy, restraints, and lobotomies. She died in 1975, an old woman who had spent nearly her entire life locked away for the crime of a broken heart. Her existence is a footnote in a dusty ledger. One of the most tragic stories is that of a young boy named Dean who was admitted in the 1940s. He was not mentally ill. He was deaf and mute, and his family could not care for him. Unable to communicate, his fear and frustration were interpreted as aggression. He was subjected to brutal treatments, and his spirit was slowly crushed. These are not ghost stories. They are the real histories buried in the asylum's archives. For every name we can recover, there are thousands that are lost forever. These were not just inmates or case numbers. They were people with families, hopes, and histories. They were farmers, housewives, soldiers, and children. They were confined, not always because they were sick, but often because they were poor, different, or simply in the way. Their stories are a reminder that the true horror of Weston is not supernatural. It is the all-too-human capacity for neglect, the bureaucratic indifference to suffering, and the ease with which society can discard the lives it deems inconvenient. Their voices were silenced in life, and their memory was nearly erased in death. In the mid-1950s, a revolution quietly began to unfold in the world of psychiatry that would signal the beginning of the end for asylums like Weston. This revolution came not in the form of architecture or surgery, but in a small pill. The development of the first antipsychotic drugs, most notably chlorpromazine, marketed as thorazine, offered a new way to manage the most severe symptoms of psychosis. For the first time, there was a treatment that could quell hallucinations, delusions, and agitation without the use of physical restraints or brutal surgeries. The effect on the overcrowded wards was dramatic. Patients who had been considered hopelessly agitated and unreachable could now be calmed to the point where they were capable of communication and limited self-care. Thorazine and other new psychotropic medications were hailed as a miracle. They were far from a perfect cure. The side effects could be severe, including tremors, stiffness, and a profound emotional blunting that became known as the Thorazine shuffle. In many ways, these drugs simply replaced the straitjacket with a chemical straitjacket, imposing control from the inside out. But they fundamentally changed the calculus of institutionalization. If a patient's symptoms could be controlled with medication, perhaps they no longer needed to be locked away for life. This new pharmacology fueled a growing political and social movement known as deinstitutionalization. Activists, civil rights lawyers, and fiscal conservatives alike began to argue for the closure of the massive, expensive, and increasingly inhumane state hospitals. The era of the Grand Asylum was drawing to a close. For Weston, with its thousands of patients and crumbling infrastructure, the writing was on the wall. But an institution of its size does not die quickly. It would take another 4 decades of slow, painful decline before its doors would finally close. The deinstitutionalization movement gained momentum through the 1960s and 1970s, driven by a combination of civil rights activism, legal challenges, and the promise of new, community-based care models. The public was becoming increasingly aware of the horrific conditions inside state hospitals, thanks to exposés from journalists and reformers. The very idea of the massive, isolated asylum was now seen as a symbol of a dark and unenlightened past. And yet Weston endured. While other, smaller institutions began to close, Weston's sheer size made it incredibly difficult to dismantle. The central problem was the patient population. Where were the thousands of people housed within its walls supposed to go? The promised network of community mental health centers was slow to materialize and was often chronically underfunded. Discharging long-term patients into a world they no longer knew without adequate support was a recipe for disaster. So the asylum entered a long twilight phase of its existence. It became a relic, a holdover from a bygone era, even while it was still a functioning hospital. The population began to slowly decrease, but hundreds of patients remained, many of them the elderly, the chronically ill, and those who had been so profoundly damaged by decades of institutionalization that they had no hope of surviving on the outside. The building itself continued to decay. The state, reluctant to pour money into an obsolete facility, funded only the most essential repairs. Entire wings were closed off and abandoned, falling into ruin while patients were consolidated into the remaining wards. The staff who remained were often those who had worked there for decades, presiding over the slow-motion collapse of the world they had always known. Weston had outlived its purpose, but it could not yet die. It lingered on, a ghost of itself, its corridors growing quieter and emptier with each passing year. By the 1980s, walking through the wards of the Weston State Hospital was like stepping into a decaying museum that was still, inexplicably, open for business. The paint was peeling, the plaster was cracked, and the grand, echoing corridors felt more like tombs than hospital hallways. The patient population had dwindled to several hundred, but those who remained were often the most difficult cases, the ones for whom deinstitutionalization had failed. The hospital was caught in a bureaucratic limbo. In 1990, in a move of profound irony, the building was designated a National Historic Landmark. The federal government recognized its architectural significance as the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in the country and a prime example of the Kirkbride Plan. The designation honored the physical structure, the beautiful, ambitious shell, even as the human reality inside was one of terminal decay. It ensured the walls would not be torn down, but it did nothing to change the fact that it was an obsolete and deeply troubled medical facility. The landmark status sealed the hospital's fate. It was now officially a historic artifact, and the state finalized its plans to build a new, modern psychiatric facility nearby. The William R. Sharp Jr. Hospital was designed to be everything Weston was not: compact, efficient, and clinical, built around pharmacology and outpatient treatment models. The architectural dream of healing was long dead, replaced by the sterile pragmatism of modern medicine. The final years were a slow, managed retreat. Wards were emptied one by one. The staff prepared for the final closure, packing up decades of records, their keys jangling in halls that were falling deeper into silence. The end was no longer a question of if, but when. The final closure of the Weston State Hospital came in May of 1994. It was not a dramatic event, but a quiet, procedural ending to 130 years of noise and turmoil. Over a period of several months, the remaining patients were transferred to the new Sharp Hospital or other facilities. Buses would arrive in the early morning fog, idling in front of the massive stone facade. Patients who had known no other home for decades, some for most of their lives, were escorted out, carrying their few personal belongings in small boxes or bags. For many, it was a terrifying and disorienting experience, another displacement after a lifetime of confinement. Staff members, some of whom had worked at the asylum for their entire careers, made final rounds through the empty wards. They walked through the silent day rooms, past the rows of stripped beds, the ghosts of thousands of patients seeming to linger in the air. They locked the heavy wooden doors for the last time, their keys turning in the locks with a sound of finality that echoed through the deserted corridors. The keys themselves, heavy rings of worn brass that had once symbolized ultimate authority, were turned in at the administrative offices, their purpose now obsolete. The institution that had begun with the grand ambition of curing madness ended with the quiet, bureaucratic ritual of a bus transfer and a final turn of a key. When the last vehicle pulled away, an immense silence descended upon the building. The clock in the tower continued to mark the hours, but inside, time had stopped. The asylum was now officially a relic, a stone behemoth left to the mercy of dust and memory. For more than a decade after its closure, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum sat empty, a sleeping giant looming over the town of Weston. The state maintained a minimal presence, but the vast structure began to succumb to the inevitable forces of decay. Windows were broken, allowing the weather and wildlife to enter. Paint peeled in long strips, revealing layers of institutional history. Dust settled like a shroud over the abandoned wards, the hydrotherapy tubs, and the empty operating rooms. The asylum became a legend, a place of rumors and ghost stories whispered among the locals. It was a magnet for urban explorers and vandals, who would slip past the fences to wander its dark, echoing halls, leaving graffiti as a testament to their trespass. The building was a massive, expensive problem for the state, too historic to demolish, but too large and dilapidated to easily repurpose. It sat in a state of suspended animation, a monument to a failed system, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Then, in 2007, the state of West Virginia decided to wash its hands of the property. The entire 242,000 square foot building, along with its surrounding grounds, was put up for public auction. On a surreal afternoon, the fate of this monument to suffering was decided by the highest bidder. The gavel fell, and the asylum was sold for $1.5 million to a private demolition contractor from Morgantown. The sale marked the final, definitive end of the asylum's life as a public institution. It was now a private commodity, its future to be determined not by the needs of the state or the mentally ill, but by the logic of the free market. The community held its breath, wondering if the new owner would tear it down, erasing the imposing landmark from the skyline forever. The new owner, Joe Jordan, had a different vision for the asylum. Instead of demolishing it, he pledged to preserve it, transforming the decaying institution into a new kind of enterprise. The building was rechristened with its original, more dramatic name, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. A massive effort of stabilization and restoration began. Scaffolding once again climbed the sandstone walls, not to build them, but to save them from collapse. The goal was to turn the asylum's dark history into its greatest asset. The building reopened to the public with a dual identity. By day, it is a historical museum. Guided tours lead visitors through the restored Civil War-era section, the administrative offices, and the first-floor wards. Guides narrate the story of Dr. Kirkbride's vision, the asylum's architectural significance, and its role in the state's history. The focus is on preservation, on honoring the building as a national historic landmark. But when darkness falls, the asylum transforms. It embraces its reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. Paranormal tour, ghost hunts, and overnight stays attract a different K. In the visitor, one seeking not history but fear. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness of the abandoned wards. Ghost hunters set up their equipment in the lobotomy recovery room or the morgue, hoping to capture evidence of the spirits of former patients. The asylum's history of suffering is repackaged as a thrilling commodity. Seasonal events, like a haunted house attraction in the fall, draw massive crowds, their screams echoing in the same halls where patients once cried out in genuine anguish. The asylum has found a new, profitable life, but it is one built on a profound and unsettling ethical tension. The asylum's current existence as both a historical landmark and a paranormal attraction creates a disquieting paradox. On one hand, the money generated from the ghost tour and haunted house events funds the enormous cost of preserving the building. Without this commercial enterprise, the structure would likely crumble into irreversible ruin, and its important history would be lost. The commercial model is, in a very real sense, saving the asylum. On the other hand, this same model risks trivializing the very real human suffering that occurred within these walls. The narrative of restless spirits and shadow figures can easily overshadow the historical reality of systemic neglect, medical brutality, and the quiet despair of thousands of lives. For every visitor who learns about the failures of the mental health system, there is another who is there simply for the cheap thrill of a ghost story. The suffering of the patients is transformed from a historical tragedy into a form of entertainment. The very spaces where people were subjected to forced labor, brutal restraints, and life-altering surgeries are now stages for a performance of fear. Velvet ropes now block off rooms not for medical quarantine, but for artifact preservation. The instruments of control, the straitjackets, the hydrotherapy tubs, the surgical tools, are displayed like macabre relics in a museum of horror. The asylum story is being curated not just by historians, but by marketers who understand that fear sells better than history. The legacy of the thousands of people who lived and died here is now filtered through the lens of what the public is willing to pay to see. The building is preserved, but at what cost to the memory of those it once imprisoned? To stand before the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum today is to be confronted by the overwhelming power of its architecture. The sheer mass of the hand-cut sandstone is staggering. The walls, 2.5 feet thick at the base, rise up with an authority that feels both magnificent and oppressive. The faint, rhythmic marks of the mason's chisels are still visible on the stone surfaces, a ghostly texture of the human labor required to build this place. The claim that it is the largest hand-cut stonemasonry building in North America, second only in scale to the Kremlin, has become part of its legend. Whether precisely true or not, the comparison captures the building's immense, fortress-like presence. Its Gothic revival details, the pointed arches, the soaring clock tower, the crenellated roof lines, were meant to evoke a sense of dignity and permanence. But they also create an undeniable atmosphere of intimidation. This is a structure designed to impose order, to dominate its landscape and the lives of those within it. The architecture is not a passive backdrop to the asylum's history. It is an active participant. The long, repeating corridors create a disorienting, labyrinthine effect. The staggered wings, designed to provide light and air, also functioned as a system of surveillance and control. The very stones seem to have absorbed the century of emotion they witnessed, the hope of the early years, the chaos of overcrowding, the terror of the treatments, the final, profound silence. The building outlasted the philosophies that created it, the doctors who ran it, and the patients who were confined by it. Its endurance is its most powerful statement. The stone remains as a silent, unmovable witness to both the highest ideals and the most profound failures of a society grappling with the mystery of the human mind. The walls do not need to be haunted by ghosts. The stones themselves tell the most terrifying story of all. The story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is the story of a beautiful idea that rotted from the inside out. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride's vision was one of enlightenment and compassion. He believed a building could be a form of medicine, that an environment of order, light, and air could heal a mind lost in chaos. Weston was to be the ultimate expression of that faith, a special apparatus for the care of lunacy. The promise was a cure. But the apparatus was only as good as the hands that operated it and the society that funded it. The ideal was suffocated by the relentless arithmetic of reality. A capacity of 250 became 700, then 1,600, then over 2,600. The deli. Kate balance of Kirkbride's design collapsed under the sheer weight of human bodies. The architecture of healing became an architecture of containment. The story of Weston is a mirror reflecting society's deepest anxieties about mental illness. When care became too expensive and too difficult, it was replaced by control. When compassion failed, brutality took its place. The hydrotherapy tubs, the straitjackets, and finally, the ice-pick lobotomy were not aberrations. They were the logical endpoint of a system that prioritized order over humanity. Was Kirkbride's theory flawed from the start? Or was it simply that no building, no matter how perfectly designed, could withstand the pressure of a society that chose to warehouse its unwanted citizens rather than truly care for them? The asylum at Weston stands as a chilling answer. It proves that even the most noble intentions, when carved into stone, can become a prison. The apparatus was sound, but the humanity that powered it was not. Today, the asylum stands preserved, its Gothic tower still keeping watch over the town. Tourists walk its corridors, their footsteps echoing where thousands of patients once shuffled in a state of quiet desperation. They take pictures of the peeling paint and the empty beds, capturing images of a decay that is both beautiful and profoundly sad. The building's history is told in two competing narratives: the architectural triumph of the Kirkbride plan and the macabre horror story sold to paranormal enthusiasts. Both narratives are true, and both are incomplete. The full story lies in the space between the ideal and the reality. It lies in the unread ledgers, in the patient records that document a life of domestic trouble, and in the census counts that chart the institution's slow collapse into chaos. The true legacy of Weston is not in its stones, but in the silence that surrounds the stories of the people who lived and died there. The most haunting record is the cemetery on the hill. The unmarked graves and numbered stones are the final, blunt evidence of the institution's ultimate failure. Here, the erasure of identity was made complete. Where Kirkbride saw a path to recovery, the earth recorded only anonymity. The asylum kept one promise perfectly. It was built to contain people, to keep them separate from the world. And in the end, it contained their stories, too, burying them in ledgers filled with blank spaces and a graveyard full of forgotten names. The silence from that hillside is the loudest sound the asylum makes. Dr. Kirkbride's asylum was a machine built from an elegant and humane blueprint. It was an apparatus designed to take in the chaos of a broken mind, and through the gentle mechanics of sunlight, routine, and space, restore it to order. For a brief moment, the promise seemed real. The first patients entered halls that were bright and spacious, a world away from the dungeons and chains of the past. But an apparatus is only a tool. And when the number of broken minds overwhelmed the machine, the operators changed its function. The goal was no longer to restore, but merely to contain. The elegant blueprint was buried under the weight of overcrowding, and the machine was retooled for a new, brutal purpose. The gears of moral treatment were replaced by the instruments of control. Hydrotherapy tubs became instruments of immobilization. Straitjackets replaced supervision. And when all else failed, the ice-pick lobotomy offered a way to permanently disconnect the troublesome parts of the human engine. The asylum became a factory that produced not sanity but silence. The cemetery on the slope behind the asylum is littered with the factory's discarded products. Thousands of bodies, their names often lost, their lives reduced to a number on a metal stake or nothing at all. The ground itself became the institution's final, most honest ledger. Today, the building stands as a monument to this catastrophic failure. Its hand-cut stone walls are a testament to an ambition that was as grand as its collapse was complete. The question that echoes in its empty halls is not whether ghosts still wander them, but whether we have learned anything at all from the very real horrors that took place there. The story of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum is not a ghost story. The true horror is not in the shadows that flicker at the edge of a flashlight beam. It is in the documented, historical fact of what human beings are capable of when they are given absolute control over the lives of others. It is the story of a society that chose to lock away its most vulnerable citizens and then forget they existed. It is the story of how a place of healing became a place of torture, one bureaucratic decision, one budget cut, one overcrowded ward at a time. The asylum's walls were built to stand for centuries, and they have. They have outlasted the philosophy that created them and the system that corrupted them. They remain as a silent, impossible witness. To walk through its halls today is to feel the immense weight of that history. The real ghosts of Weston are not the spirits of the dead, but the lingering questions about our own capacity for cruelty and neglect. If this story has unsettled you, make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into history's darkest corners. And now we want to hear from you. After hearing its history, would you be brave enough to walk the halls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum at night? Let us know in the comments below.